Hello, you're watching RPTV News, and my name is Dmitry Martinovich. In the downtown Toronto East area, which includes Regent Park, Gerrard, Broadview, Riverdale, St. Jamestown, and Moss Park neighborhoods, Cantonese and Mandarin-speaking immigrants comprise nearly 8% of the population. Many Chinese immigrants in these neighborhoods face language and employment barriers that prevent them from accessing the array of COVID-19 services and supports that many Canadians take for granted. Added to these everyday challenges, in recent months, the Toronto Chinese community and elsewhere in Canada has been experiencing a rise of anti-Asian racism, much of it linked to rhetoric, prejudice, and misconceptions about the coronavirus. In this issue of RPTV News, we talked to Avi Yaya Go, a Toronto lawyer and activist, about anti-Asian racism and about the website COVIDracism.ca, an internet tool designed to track incidents of anti-Asian racism across Canada. Let's join Avi now as she talks about the internet tool COVIDracism.ca and the rise of anti-Asian racism in Canada. Hello, Avi, and welcome to RPTV News. I wonder if you'd take a moment and tell us about yourself, about what motivated you to become involved in the law and the advocacy work that you later developed.
So I work for a legal clinic. It's called the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic. We've been around for a long time. I became involved with the clinic when I was still a law student at U of T, and the clinic was looking for board members at the time. So I became involved in the founding board. But certainly, although I wasn't motivated by this kind of work when I first went to law school. However, after starting in law school, and I volunteered with the downtown legal services, and we start to see clients coming in, racialized client with various issues, such as, mistreatment by the police. I was working in the Chinatown satellite office. So all of the clients that came in were Chinese immigrants, didn't speak any English, had problem accessing legal services. So a lot of the issues that are still true today, and I start to see them when I was still a student. So I became interested in doing this kind of work as a result of that. And so since I graduated from law school, after I finished article, I pretty much just stayed in the legal clinic system and have been working in this area ever since.
In the historical context of anti-Asian racism in Canada, there have been periods in the past when racism and xenophobic rhetoric and behavior were allowed to flourish. I'm thinking of the Chinese head tax and the Japanese internment camps. What is it about this moment that has precipitated the current anti-Asian racism, and why did you feel the need to create the website COVIDracism.ca to track these incidents?
The history of anti-Asian racism began even before the Chinese head tax or the internment of Japanese Canadians. In fact, I would argue that it began as Canada became a country. As some of your audience may know, the first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, had famously described Chinese, or at that time they called them Chinamen, as strangers to the strange land, sojourners, and basically saying that they do not share any quote-unquote British instinct. As a result of that, Macdonald disenfranchised all Chinese and decided to not to give them a right to vote. And that was the first time, in the history of Canada that a whole group of people were excluded from the right to vote, apart from the Chinese, of course, so-called Indians. So the First Nations, indigenous people were also disenfranchised at the same time. So I think that also the first Royal Commission on Immigration was on Chinese immigrants, because after Chinese people were brought to Canada to build a railroad, without which Canada as a country would not have existed. Right away, Canada decided to exclude or find way to exclude Chinese immigrants to Canada. So in the 1885 Royal Commission, they talked about how Chinatowns were filthy, sort of all those stereotypes of Chinese being dirty. The yellow peril concept was first brought into bear back in 1885. So there's a very long history in Canada, and I guess in North America in general, of linking Chinese to diseases. And so this is nothing new, and it's not really restricted to COVID-19. People might remember, the Asian flu, and then SARS in 2003. There was also another wave of anti-Asian, particularly anti-Chinese sentiment and racism at that time as well. So it's just yet another incident of how Chinese, Asian in general, but Chinese in particular, were being singled out as people who brought diseases to Canada. This othering of Chinese as foreigners, as non-Canadians, is really nothing new, and it has a very deep historical root in Canada.
Well, I just wanted to say that I really like the website, and I wonder if you could spend a little bit of time to explain to our audience why you created the website and what your expectations were around how it would be used.
The original website was actually created by the CCNCTO, the Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter. They created a very more simple website back in February, shortly after we start to see anti-Chinese incidents all across the country, but particularly in Toronto. However, in April, March, towards the end of March, our clinic was approached by Canadian Heritage, who wanted to, allow us to access funding to the Digital Citizen Project that looks at online misinformation in the context of COVID-19. So we were given funding. With that, we worked in collaboration with CCNCTO, as well as the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, and a group in Vancouver called Citizens Engagement Network. So we look at the whole anti-Asian, anti-Chinese incident within COVID-19, and with the funding, CCNC Toronto then were able to really build on their website and launched it as we saw it in May. Called COVID Racism. We wanted to create this website because we know that there are a lot of anti-Chinese and anti-racism incidents out there. Many people are, sharing it online anyways. Like, they talk about it on social media, but there isn't a depository for all of these reports to be, to go in one place. And we wanted to document these incidents because a lot of people in the mainstream and the general public may not see this as an anti-Asian racism issue, and the government in particular was not, at the time, was not interested in this issue at all. And also we are hearing that some people have gone to the police to report it as hate crime, but the police were not taking these cases seriously. So all of these reasons kind of drive us to create the website, allow people to share their experiences, and from there we could also talk about the anti-Asian racism in a more coherent manner, but more importantly, to develop some policy responses from these stories in order to push the government for more systemic change in the long run.
Thank you, Alvi. On the website, COVIDracism.ca, there is mention that the documentation gathered by the tool would be used to inform future efforts for collective action against anti-Asian racism and xenophobia. Can you explain what the long-term expectations of the project might be?
Sure. So I can give you an example, a very simple example. If you look at Canada's anti-racism strategy that was developed by the Canadian government in 2019, it's a very simple document with some kind of just aspirational goals, but there's no timetable, no concrete action. However, just a very simple fact, the entire strategy did not even once mention the existence of anti-Asian racism in Canada. So I think that the refusal to name the issue and not acknowledge that this issue exists would prevent Canada or at least give the government an excuse not to address it. And so one of the policy objectives probably would be to push the Canadian government as well as the provincial governments, because these things are happening in all provinces, to get them to acknowledge that anti-Asian racism exists. It is an issue that needs to be addressed. And it is part of the systemic racism that, where now, more and more people are discussing right now. Certainly, it's of a very different nature from the anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. Those are very important issues that we as all Canadians, must work to eliminate. But that is not to say that anti-Asian racism does not exist. So we need the policymakers to also acknowledge its existence so that we can combat it.
When we talk about prejudice and racism, it has been said that prejudices, we all got those, but it's the hate prejudice that does us ill. Racism as a term is a relatively new concept, first appearing only in the 1930s. Can you parse out the meaning of these two terms, prejudice and racism?
So I guess for me, when I think of racism, first of all, of course, prejudice can be of different kinds. It may not be based on one's race. So for sure, racism, to me, it's a system of belief, that there, within which that raises we socially construct this concept of race, and that it is very much tied to the concept of white supremacy and white superiority as well in the Canadian and North American context, meaning that the dominant group, the white dominant racial group, is seen as superior to other racial groups, including Blacks, including Indigenous, and including Asians and Chinese. So I situate my understanding of racism very much in the Canadian context, and this is what I see racism is about. And because it's a very much entrenched belief system, it is reflected in all the institutions within Canada. So it becomes institutionalized and becomes part of the structural and systemic racism that we are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So whereas prejudice can be a one-on-one thing, and I may have prejudice about some people, but I cannot, because it is me as part of, when it becomes part of the system, when that prejudice and belief becomes part of the system and it's based on race, then it becomes racism, and it becomes systemic racism.
So, as someone who has been involved in the struggle to redress the effects of racism, what can be done to tackle racism at the structural level and at the individual level?
It is much more important to address racism at the structural and institutional level. I'm not saying that we need not address individual concept of racism and prejudice, but I'm saying that as a person of color, as a Chinese Canadian, I am much more, far more impacted by institutional and structural racism than by the individual act of racism. If my government cannot or does not even acknowledge that I have full equal right than any other Canadian, what chance do I have to to strive in Canada, right? So to me, the number one priority must be to address systemic racism. And part of that is educating Canadians on an individual level through public education, through sort of changing our curriculum, starting from kindergarten and primary school and secondary school and so on and so forth. But that will not come about until structural and systemic racism or the existence of that is being acknowledged. Because how do you change an individual's mind? It is through through education. But our education system will not change until the system is changed. So, like, to me, it is completely the priority must start with the structure and with our government and with the institution.
So, yes, at the structural level, there are ways that you can approach politicians, that you can lobby them, you can get people involved to change policies. But at the individual level, we have to understand that there is a psychology of racism, which is based on fear and on wanting to belong.
I'm not saying that addressing individual racism is not important, and certainly we see that manifest in the way that the anti-Asian sort of racism acts out right now across Canada. It's the individual, Canadians, mostly white, who go about and target other Canadians of Asian descent, right? So these individuals, in their own individual view, are seeing Canadians of Asian descent as a threat, and therefore they feel entitled to go after them, right? So those are, individual beliefs, right? Certainly, it is important to name them, but without the structural, without the system to support groups like ours to call out these acts of racism and to address them, then those acts will just continue. And that's why we have been focusing on lobbying the Canadian government, particularly the federal government at that level, to call out the Prime Minister and work with the Minister of Diversity, Inclusion and Youth to come up with a strategy to address it. And we've been calling out police for their failure to treat these crimes as hate crimes. But it's more difficult for us to say. I mean, how would you know next time which who you run into on the street is going to attack you? It's impossible for us to do that, and that's why we must address it from a systemic point of view.
How much of the current wave of anti-Asian racism is, do you think, driven by the global pandemic, and how much of it could be attributed to pre-existing tensions in global economics and political differences?
The way I see racism and anti-Asian racism in particular is that it has always existed in Canada, as I have mentioned earlier. The historical context, the portrayal of Chinese Canadians and other Asian Canadians as yellow peril. To me, the pandemic is just the excuse for this kind of sentiment and racism to manifest itself in Canada. So because if it's a global pandemic, then it shouldn't just be Chinese Canadians who are being targeted, or it cannot simply be Asian Canadians who are targeted. Particularly, we know that The number of cases, for instance, in Ontario, are due largely to travel cases from Europe and the US. It is not due to travel from China. So by saying that this is because of the pandemic, therefore we have anti-Asian and anti-Chinese racism, does not explain why our communities is being targeted. Why aren't Italian Canadians being targeted when there were so many cases in Italy? Why aren't Brazilian Canadians being targeted when Brazil is like the number 2, number 1 now, right? So it is because of the pre-existing racism in Canada targeting Asian that we have this sentiment being expressed right now. And I think, of course, it is being fueled by comments like people like Donald Trump, which call us the Chinese virus. And of course, people who do have, sort of misgiving about the relationship between China and Canada, who already have pre-existing racist sentiments towards Chinese. This will give them another reason to blame the Chinese Canadians and Asian Canadians for having the virus here in Canada. So I think we really need to name the root of this sentiment. It is not about the pandemic. It is about racism that already existed in Canada.
So that we are located, our organization is located in Regent Park. There are approximately about 100,000 people that live in what is called the Toronto Centre, of which Regent Park, Moss Park, Cabbagetown, St. Jamestown, all of those areas are part of that. Within that area, about 40% of the people are immigrants. And about 8% of that population are Mandarin and Cantonese speakers. And they comprise about 11% of the visible minority population in that area. What do you feel are the main issues facing that community, which is predominantly an immigrant community?
So we also see a lot of clients from Regent Park, as with many immigrants of color. The Chinese immigrants, recent arrivals, and newcomers tend to be overrepresented in the low-income population, right? And also they face a number of barriers, including linguistic barriers, cultural barriers in accessing legal services and other services. As newcomers, as immigrants, they also tend to be in core housing need. They have a higher unemployment rate or underemployment rate. Many have food insecurity issue. So it's true for not just Chinese immigrants, but for other immigrants of color as well. But Chinese immigrants face that problem also. As we also know that as Chinese, we are also overrepresented in the low-income population in Ontario. The general poverty rate for all of Ontario is 14.1%. For Chinese is around 23%. And I'm sure that that's higher for immigrants within the Chinese community. So, we see that at our clinic, and because of their poverty, because of their race, they certainly faces a number of challenges that other white Canadian-born people would not face. So from our end, we are more focusing on the legal issues, but certainly they face other social barriers as well.
So what are some of the key legal issues that you see Chinese and Asian immigrants dealing with when they're in Canada?
We see, I guess I would say, two main areas. One is employment, the other is immigration. So for the employment kind of issues, as immigrants, especially those who do not speak English as their first language, they tend to work in very precarious employment where they are easily exploited by the employer. Many of them do not have, they may not even be making minimum wage income. The employers don't obey the law. They don't follow Employment Standards Act. So there are a lot of exploitation issues. People are owed wages. They work overtime without overtime pay, never collect vacation pay, and so on and so forth. And a lot of them are in cash jobs. Employers do not deduct income tax and CPP and EI from them. So even when they lose their job, they can't even access EI because they can't prove that they have insurable hours and insurable incomes. And now with the pandemic, they can't even access the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefits, because they can't prove their previous income or their employment. So a lot of these issues are tied to the fact that they work in precarious work. And if they have precarious immigration status, many of them do, they face even more challenges because they don't even have the valid work permit to apply for these benefits. And we also see a lot of, newcomers, they face challenges in having, for instance, they want to sponsor their family to Canada because they are low income. They are not able to do that, particularly if they want to sponsor parents and grandparents. They can't meet the income requirement. So they have a hard time settling in Canada because they cannot bring the whole family to Canada. So the process of integration is slower for many of these newcomers, while at the same time, because of their race and immigration status, lack of language, they can't establish themselves fast enough to meet the income requirement in order to sponsor their family.
Thank you, Avi. So can you, the website has been active now for really only a little while. What has been the response and feedback that you've received?
We know as of yesterday, we have already received over 300 reports from across Canada. Many of them are from, vast majority are from Asian Canadians who report incidents of, sort of harassment and, on the street, spitting, being spat at. We have also seen some, of course, more serious cases as well being reported, including stabbing in Montreal, punching, in Vancouver, and so on and so forth. So it's very disconcerting. Some of the individuals who reported online have given the organization consent to reach out to them to find out more about the story. So we hope to be able to collect more detailed stories that, with their permission, of course, we may be able to share some of those with the broader public. So, but right now we're, sort of keeping these, in this incident kind of, where it's establishing a timeline and a map that will be presented on the website, later in the year. And hopefully that will kind of inform policy discussion in the future.
Yes, as I said earlier, I really enjoyed the website and the events that are on the website really provoked a lot of thought. Now, is there anything else that you would like to say about the website or the broader issue of anti-Asian racism?
Anti-Asian racism that we are experiencing now, and we have always experienced, is particularly challenging for us to deal with, because unlike the people who are doing this to us are not members of KKK. Mm-hmm. These are ordinary Canadians. When they're just walking down the street or, sort of going to a grocery store to shop, they feel emboldened and entitled to target, harass, attack someone simply because they are Asian, right? So it's very insidious, and it just shows how entrenched that anti-Asian sentiment is within Canada. So, and that is why we feel so, this issue is very urgent in the sense that it is happening even more so now, but it has always existed, and our government are not paying enough attention to it. And we're just hoping that with the spike in these incidents with websites like COVID Racism, we can highlight how important these types of racism is, and the impact it is having on our community, that we can no longer turn a blind eye to these issues, and the government must act to combat anti-Asian racism in Canada.
Thank you, Avi. As you have emphasized, anti-Asian racism is deeply embedded in the history of Canada. Forms of systemic racism also target people of color and our own Indigenous people. You've been watching RPTV, and my name is Dimitria Martinovic. Join us again when we continue to bring you stories and issues of critical importance to our communities.
Like, share, and subscribe to our channel. For more information, follow us on all our social media platforms. And don't forget to visit our website, as well as comment down below what you thought about this video.